She thought it was just one night, an exciting escape, a secret no one would ever know. But when her husband finds out, the night takes a deadly turn, and suddenly there's no way back. Some choices redefine lives, leaving behind indelible marks, reminders of the moments when everything changed. This is one such story, filled with unforeseen turns and raw, unfiltered human emotion. Servers and kitchen staff weaved seamlessly through the restaurant, balancing trays and arranging dinnerware, their movements a well-rehearsed dance of efficiency. At a table in the far corner, Frank Walker sat alone, absently swirling the remnants of his drink as he observed the lively scene before him. Diners clinked glasses, laughed freely, and some took short strolls outside to make calls, relishing the carefree atmosphere of the evening. Coffee and cocktails flowed without pause, adding to the celebratory ambience. Yet Frank was far from reveling in the moment. His mind was occupied with a cryptic note that had been discreetly placed on his table, a warning from an unnamed server. The message was simple but deeply unsettling. Mark Leah had his sights set on Frank's wife. Initially he dismissed it as nonsense, but curiosity got the better of him and he read the note again. As his eyes lifted from the paper, his stomach knotted. There she was, his wife, swaying on the dance floor with Leah, their bodies close, their laughter just a little too intimate. He tried to brush it off, reasoning that it was harmless. But when they disappeared together for a second time, unease clawed at his chest. Determined to act, Frank prepared to rise from his chair, but before he could, the music faded, and he spotted them emerging from the crowd. He exhaled slowly, relieved, watching as Leah led his wife toward a nearby table where a few of his acquaintances were seated. Frank remained still, observing as they spoke for a few minutes. Then, without fanfare, Leah excused himself, disappearing into the night. His wife soon followed suit, returning to Frank's table. She leaned down, pressing a kiss to his cheek, murmuring words of love before announcing she needed to step away for a moment. Frank nodded, watching as she moved gracefully through the dining area, heading toward the corridor that led to the restrooms. But something about the way she said it, the slight hesitation, the way her voice lingered on the words, pricked at his instincts. Something wasn't right. Without hesitation he stood, determined to follow. But he had barely taken a step when Mark Leah's companions, just as the note had forewarned, rose from their seats, moving deliberately to intercept his path. Frank Walker wasn't just any man. He made his living solving problems, often the kind that others were too afraid to confront. And right now, a problem was standing directly in front of him. Frank Walker's work often took him across borders, flying from one country to another to restore stability in corporations and organizations plagued by administrative failures, financial crises, or internal power struggles. His expertise lay in navigating high-stakes environments, where corruption and backdoor dealings were the norm. On a daily basis he confronted arrogant executives, individuals who had clawed their way to the top through deception, bribery, and intimidation. Many took pride in their ruthlessness, exploiting employees, leveraging their power to silence opposition, and relishing in their unchecked authority. Frank, however, had no tolerance for such behavior. His role often required him to dismantle the systems that enabled these figures to thrive, making him the target of resistance, aggression, and, at times, outright threats. One such instance had nearly escalated into real danger. A powerful narcotics syndicate had sent warnings his way when he spearheaded the relocation of a U.S. manufacturing company from Mexico to Alabama, a move that disrupted their operations. Despite the threats, Frank remained undeterred. The transition proceeded as planned, solidifying his reputation as someone who couldn't be intimidated. Thriving in adversity, he had built his career on facing down ambitious, ruthless, and dangerous individuals, breaking their influence with calculated precision. So when Mark Leah, towering but inexperienced, along with his companions attempted to block his way, Frank swiftly turned the tables. With just a few measured words, he stripped them of their confidence, making them realize, perhaps for the first time, the weight of the consequences they might face. The shift was immediate. Leah's group, suddenly less sure of themselves, hesitated before stepping aside. With nothing barring his path, Frank wasted no time and hurried after Brooke. He caught sight of her near the restaurant's rear exit, moving with a sense of purpose. "Brooke," he called out. She didn't slow down, didn't even glance his way. Either she hadn't heard him or she was choosing to ignore him. Frank quickened his pace, the distance between them shrinking. "Brooke, where are you going?" His voice was firm this time, demanding an answer. At last she stopped. Turning to face him, her expression was a mixture of irritation and surprise, as though his presence there was unexpected and unwelcome. There was something in her demeanor, something distant and defensive, that sent a fresh wave of unease through him. Frank met her gaze, his own filled with questions. "I should be asking you the same thing," he said evenly. "What exactly are you doing here?" Frank's gaze remained steady as he pressed again, his voice firm but calm. "Brooke, where are you going?" She hesitated, her lips parting as if to respond, but the words faltered before they could escape. Her eyes met his for a brief moment before she looked away, her thoughts tangled in the weight of the moment. This wasn't how things were supposed to unfold. He wasn't supposed to be here. Frank took a step closer. "Brooke?" he prompted again, his patience thinning. She exhaled slowly, knowing there was no easy way out of this. Making up a lie would be pointless. Frank would see through it immediately. She had no choice but to tell him the truth, no matter how much it would hurt him, or how much she wished she could avoid saying it. Earlier that evening, Brooke had crossed paths with Mark Leia entirely by chance. After leaving the restroom, she had been heading back to their table when she unknowingly walked past Leia's. He had noticed her immediately, rising from his seat with effortless charm and halting her with a polite greeting. Introducing himself, he engaged her in a brief but pleasant conversation before she excused herself and returned to Frank and the rest of their group. As the night unfolded, the celebration reached its peak. The air buzzed with laughter and conversation, and soon the live band arrived, setting the tone for the evening's next chapter. The moment the music began, Mark Leia approached their table once more. His presence drew immediate attention. As a well-known local soccer player, Mark was something of a hometown celebrity, and his arrival was met with excitement. He greeted everyone warmly, shaking hands, posing for photos, signing autographs, his easy charisma drawing people in effortlessly. Then, after exchanging pleasantries, he turned to Brooke with an unexpected invitation. "Dance with me," he had said with a confident smile. Brooke had been taken aback. Caught off guard, she had instinctively declined. But Mark was persistent, though never pushy. His charm was undeniable. Encouraged by the group's enthusiasm and the fact that Frank had voiced no objections, she found herself reluctantly accepting. As Mark led her onto the dance floor, Brooke had felt a nervous tension knotting in her stomach. But once they began to move, she quickly realized that dancing with Mark Leia was nothing like she had anticipated. Mark Leia was young, confident, and undeniably attractive. As a professional athlete, he carried himself with the kind of effortless boldness that naturally drew attention. But beyond that, he was an exceptional dancer. His movements were fluid, deliberate, his touch firm yet considerate. From the moment his hand found hers, Brooke felt something stir inside her. He held her exactly how she liked to be held, spoke in a way that made her feel seen, understood. His voice was smooth, his words carefully chosen, each one crafted to charm her, to pull her deeper into his orbit. She hadn't planned on dancing with him more than once, but something about him made it impossible to resist. Each time he extended his hand, she found herself accepting, drawn in by his presence. As the evening wore on, the distance between them grew smaller, the boundary between simple amusement and something more beginning to blur. What had started as harmless fun took on an intensity she hadn't anticipated. The attraction was undeniable now, a physical pull she couldn't ignore. By the time the night neared its end, they had danced countless times, and the familiarity between them had deepened. Then, as the final song played and the crowd around them slowly dissipated, Mark guided her off the dance floor, leading her toward a quieter, more secluded part of the venue. There, away from the watching eyes of the party, he turned to her, his expression different now, more intent, more certain. Without hesitation, he pulled her into an embrace. His lips met hers, firm and deliberate, his hands moving gently but purposefully along her back. He whispered to her then, speaking of how he felt, how drawn he was to her. He painted a vivid picture of the night they could share together, just the two of them, away from prying eyes. "Come with me," he murmured, his voice laced with quiet promise. "Let's go somewhere private, somewhere we can be ourselves. No distractions, no interruptions. Just us." His words sent a shiver down her spine. He described, in intimate detail, how the night would unfold, how he would make her feel, how their connection would deepen in ways she'd never forget. Back at the table, as she sat beside Frank, surrounded by laughter and conversation, Brooke found herself unable to focus. Her thoughts swirled, torn between two conflicting desires. Leaving Frank behind to go with Mark would be reckless, impulsive. She barely knew him. And yet, the mere idea sent a thrill through her unlike anything she had felt before. She had noticed attractive men before, of course, she wasn't blind. But it had never been more than a fleeting appreciation. Never had she felt something like this. Tonight was different. Brooke felt the weight of her emotions pulling her in opposite directions. On one hand, she longed for Mark's touch, the thrill of surrendering to something new and exhilarating. But on the other, guilt gnawed at her, guilt for betraying Frank's trust, for disregarding the vows they had built their life upon. She searched for a justification, something that would make her decision feel less like a betrayal and more like an opportunity, one she could accept within her own moral framework. And in her mind she found it. Mark wasn't just any man. He was a celebrated athlete, a symbol of confidence and success, someone who carried himself with a magnetism that few could resist. But beyond that, he had an air of sincerity, a quiet sense of honor that captivated her. He represented something different, a dream, a fantasy of passion unburdened by routine. And now he was offering her a moment unlike any other, an experience she might never have again. Brooke convinced herself that Frank would understand. He wouldn't see this as betrayal, she reasoned, but rather as an adventure, a fleeting indulgence that she was meant to experience. After all, he was more than her husband, he was her best friend. If anyone could comprehend her desire to seize this one opportunity, it would be him. He would be disappointed, of course, but deep down he would accept it. At that moment, Mark turned to her, his voice low and expectant. "Are you ready?" Brooke let out a soft laugh, surrendering fully. "Yes," she admitted. There was no hesitation now. As the final song faded, Mark took her hand, leading her back to the table to finalize their departure. He reassured her, promising she had nothing to worry about, that he would handle any concerns Frank might have. She wanted to believe him. Moments later, she stood near the rear exit, waiting for Mark, ready to leave. But just as they were about to slip away, their plan unraveled. Frank appeared at the back door. His presence alone was enough to send a jolt through her, a stark reminder that this wasn't just a fantasy, it was a decision with consequences. Mark squared his shoulders, unfazed. But Brooke's breath caught in her throat. Frank's expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady. "You're not leaving, Brooke. Not until you explain yourself." Mark scoffed, stepping forward. "Frank, you don't own her. Move aside and let her go." Frank didn't flinch. "She's my wife," he said firmly. "And I deserve an answer." Brooke swallowed hard. She had convinced herself that this moment would be simple, that Frank would somehow understand. But now, staring into his eyes, she saw the depth of his pain, the quiet storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. With a nervous exhale, she realized she owed him the truth. "Frank," she began, her voice shaking, "I know how awful this sounds, and honestly I can't believe it myself." "I'm doing this, Frank," Brooke declared, her voice rushed as if saying it quickly would make it easier. "I'm going to Mark's for the night." She could see the shock settle over his face, but before he could respond, she pressed on. "But Frank, it's only for tonight," she insisted. "He'll bring me back tomorrow?" For a brief moment, Frank felt his grip on his emotions slip. He had warned himself this might happen, had felt the uneasy pull of doubt creeping in throughout the night, but hearing her say it out loud, so casually, so decisively, sent a jolt of disbelief through him. "What am I thinking?" He let out a bitter laugh, running a hand over his face before his voice hardened. "I'll tell you exactly what I'm thinking, Brooke. I think this is unbelievable. I think this is insane." His voice rose, uncharacteristically sharp, and it startled her. Brooke had never seen him like this. Frank was steady, calm, the man who always kept his composure no matter the situation. But now there was something raw in his expression, something she hadn't anticipated. Fear. Hurt. And it terrified her. "Oh God, Frank. I'm sorry." "I'm so sorry," she whispered, unable to meet his gaze. Frank inhaled deeply, trying to steady his voice. "Why, Brooke?" he asked, quieter this time but with no less weight. "Why are you doing this?" She hesitated, struggling to find the right words, the words that would make him understand. "Because," she finally breathed, "this is something I've dreamed of. It's a chance, a moment that I may never have again. And Frank, you'll be happy because you supported me in this. We'll move on from it." She searched his face, hoping, praying, that he would believe her. But the devastation in his expression made her stomach twist. "So that's it," Frank said bitterly. "You're tossing me aside for a night with your charming prince? Someone you think is better than me?" "No, Frank." Brooke shook her head, desperation creeping into her voice. "That's not what I mean. You're special. You're a real man. And yet, you're still choosing to leave me for him," Frank countered, his voice hollow. Brooke clenched her fists. "I'm not walking away from what we have. she said, though even as the words left her lips, she knew how empty they sounded. But tonight I won't be by your side. I'll be with Mark. And I need you to understand that. Please, Frank, she pleaded. I don't want to make this a dramatic ordeal. Frank let out a slow, measured breath, his expression unreadable now. Why, Brooke? He asked, his voice quieter but no less piercing. Why do you think I should just be okay with you sleeping with another man and then coming back to me as if nothing happened? Brooke's throat tightened. Because, Frank, she said, her voice shaking, you've always had an open heart. You've always respected my emotions. Frank scoffed. My emotions? You mean the ones I should just cast aside while you go on your little adventure with Mark Leia? This isn't just a fling, she burst out. And no, I don't expect you to be okay with it. I'm just asking you to acknowledge my feelings, my needs. She took a step closer, her eyes pleading. Because you love me. Because you're my best friend. My kindred spirit. And I know deep down that you want me to have this experience. Frank held her gaze, searching for something, anything, that would make this make sense. But all he found was the sinking realization that no matter what he said, she had already made her choice. This is my plea to you, Frank, Brooke said softly, her eyes searching his. Please understand. Frank considered her words for a long moment. His mind raced, turning over everything she had said, everything she was asking of him. Finally he exhaled, his voice low and measured. So, you want me to simply accept this? To stand aside while you go off with Mark, indulge in whatever you call love and intimacy? Brooke shook her head quickly. Frank, I've already told you, this isn't about love. I don't love him. I love you. Then what is it about? She hesitated, then took a breath. It's physical, she admitted. I'm attracted to Mark in that way, but emotionally? My heart belongs to you. Frank let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. So, you're separating love from physical desire? That's how you're justifying this? Yes, Frank, she said, her voice urgent. I'm going to Mark tonight because of physical attraction. But I'll come back to you because of love. You are my husband. My closest ally. Frank's expression hardened. You realize how absurd that sounds, don't you? You want to spend the night with Mark and then return to me as if nothing happened? Tears welled up in Brooke's eyes as she realized how quickly the situation was unraveling. Frank, please, she whispered. Are you really telling me that if I spend just one night with him, you'd throw away our marriage? Frank's answer came without hesitation. Absolutely. His voice was calm, resolute, unwavering. Brooke's sorrow morphed into anger. The argument she had carefully constructed in her mind was falling apart, and Frank wasn't responding the way she had hoped. Do my feelings mean nothing to you? She demanded, her voice rising. Do my desires not matter? Frank's jaw tightened. Brooke, don't stand there and pretend you didn't think this through, he shot back. Because you did. You made your choice long before I found you here. The only thing you didn't consider was how I'd feel about it. Her hands trembled. Frank, please, trust me. I wasn't going to leave without telling you. He sighed, shaking his head. It doesn't matter now. We both understand where we stand. There's no more guessing, no more wondering. Now we face reality. Brooke swallowed hard, her breath shaky as she met his gaze. And what is the reality, Frank? She asked hesitantly. His eyes darkened, his voice steady as he spoke. The reality is this. There's the exit, he said, motioning toward the door. And Mark is waiting for you outside. I imagine he's growing impatient, Frank said, his voice unwavering. The choice is yours, Brooke. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Then, without hesitation, Brooke spoke. Frank, I won't walk through that door, she declared firmly. I refuse to leave you for him. I won't abandon us. The weight of her own words struck her almost instantly, like a wave crashing over her. The reality of what she had nearly done, the choices she had justified, hit her with full force. Oh my God, she gasped, shaking her head as if trying to rid herself of the thoughts that had led her here. No, 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 what was I thinking? Frank studied her carefully, his expression unreadable. That's what I'd like to know, he said evenly. What happened, Brooke? I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm completely confused. I can't believe I actually thought leaving with Mark wouldn't be wrong, that it wouldn't hurt you. Frank listened, but the doubt in his eyes was unmistakable. Brooke saw it immediately and knew she needed to be completely honest. Frank, I swear, I don't know what got into me, she said, desperation creeping into her voice. It all started so fast, the way he spoke to me, the way he made me feel. It was like, she trailed off, suddenly questioning everything. Like a trick. Frank finished for her. Brooke hesitated and Frank reached into his pocket, unfolding the note he had received earlier. "This is what's written here," he said, handing it to her. Her eyes widened as she scanned the words. A wave of shock coursed through her. "I don't believe it," she muttered, rereading the note over and over. "He singled me out, led me on?" "He played you," Frank confirmed, his voice steady. "Everything he said, every move he made, it was all part of the game." Brooke felt her stomach drop. "So I was just a target?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "That's exactly what you were," Frank said. "Just another conquest for the weak." She felt a deep sense of devastation settle over her. The realization that she had nearly thrown everything away for a fleeting illusion was unbearable. Looking up at Frank, she reached for his hand, her grip tight with emotion. "Promise me," she pleaded. "Promise me we'll never find ourselves in this situation again." Frank didn't answer immediately. Instead, as he turned toward the exit, his gaze landed on two of Mark's companions still lingering near the doorway, watching them closely. "Brooke," he said, his tone serious. "Wait here. I need to speak with them." "Frank, please," she urged. "Let it go. We don't need any more trouble tonight." But he shook his head. "I can't just walk away from this." And with that, Frank stepped forward, leaving Brooke behind. As he approached the two men, they exchanged glances, clearly aware of what was coming. "Gentlemen," Frank said, his voice firm. "We need to talk." "I swear to you, Frank," Brooke said with unwavering conviction. "After everything that's happened, I will never let another man come between us again." Frank studied her for a long moment before nodding. "All right," he said. "And when we go out like we did tonight, I'll do my part to help you keep that promise." His voice was calm, but there was something deeper beneath it, something unresolved. "I should have stepped in sooner, before Mark had the chance to lure you in. But I didn't. So maybe this isn't just your mistake, Brooke. Maybe some of the blame falls on me too." He exhaled, then added, "But it also falls on him. Laval knew you were married and he still pursued you. That I can't forgive." Just as he finished speaking, the hum of an approaching vehicle filled the air. An SUV rolled to a stop near them and the passenger window lowered. Mark Laval sat inside, his expression unreadable. "Come on, Brooke," he called out, his voice impatient. "You said you wanted to come with me, so let's go." Frank stepped forward without hesitation. "She's not going anywhere with you, Laval." Mark scoffed, shifting his attention to Frank. "I wasn't talking to you, old man," he sneered before turning back to Brooke. "Come on, Brooke. Get in." Brooke stood frozen, staring at Mark, her mind spinning. "No, Mark," she finally said, her voice steady. "I'm not going with you." Mark's jaw clenched. "Brooke," he said more forcefully this time, "get in the car." Frank took another step forward. "She said no," he stated firmly. "You lost." A flicker of frustration passed over Mark's face before his expression darkened. His hand moved quickly, too quickly. In an instant he revealed a gun. The air grew thick with tension. Mark's voice was eerily calm, but the menace in it was unmistakable. "She's coming with me," he declared. "And if you try to stop it, I'll make sure you don't leave here alive." Frank instinctively took a step back, creating some space between them, raising his hands in a controlled, non-threatening manner. His palms faced outward, fingers spread. He needed to keep the situation from spiraling out of control. "Lower the gun," Frank said evenly, his tone measured. "You don't want to do this, Laval." Mark's breathing was heavy, erratic. He was losing control, driven by desperation. "You ruined this for me," Mark snapped. "You got in the way." Frank didn't flinch. He held Laval's gaze, keeping his voice calm but firm. "Listen to me. If you put that gun down now, we can walk away from this without it going any further." The SUV sat idling, the tension between them thick and suffocating. Frank knew that one wrong move could change everything. But he had already made up his mind. One way or another he was going to end this. Frank moved with precision, drawing his pistol in one swift motion. His grip was steady, his aim unwavering. He had only seconds to act. Hesitation could mean retaliation, and that was a risk he wasn't willing to take. 2 shots rang out. Each bullet found its mark. Laval staggered backward, a groan escaping his lips as his body recoiled from the impact. Frank kept his stance firm, his focus locked onto him. "Stay calm," Frank ordered. Mark's breathing was labored, his hand trembling as he clutched his side. Did you shoot me?" he gasped. Frank didn't look away. "Yes, Mark. You were shot." Mark's expression twisted in confusion, his mind struggling to process what had happened. "Who shot me?" A voice answered from behind. "I did," the officer admitted. Mark's gaze shifted, his eyes widening in shock. "Marjorie?" he breathed. "Yes, Mark," she confirmed, stepping forward, her weapon still trained on him. His face contorted with pain and disbelief. "Why?" he whispered. "Why would you shoot me?" Marjorie's voice was calm but firm. "Because you were about to kill this man," she stated. Mark's breaths grew shallower, his body weakening as blood pooled around him. He winced, his lips trembling. "It hurts," he choked out. "Oh God, it hurts so much, please." His strength failed him. A few moments later, his chest stopped rising. His body went still. Frank knelt down, checking for a pulse. He pressed his fingers against Mark's neck, waiting, hoping, but there was nothing. He checked again. Still nothing. Mark Lavalier was dead. The events of the night unraveled from there. By the time authorities cleared Frank and Brooke to leave the restaurant, it was past 11:30 p.m. Law enforcement had spent hours interviewing them, along with the other witnesses who had seen the altercation unfold. Detectives, special agents, internal affairs, and even an assistant prosecutor were present. Each wanted an account of what had transpired, the encounter, the conflict, the final, fatal moment. Mark Laval had been a rising star, a young man with unchecked arrogance, a volatile nature, and a deadly weapon. Frank Walker, on the other hand, was a seasoned strategist. Someone who had spent years dismantling powerful figures, exposing their weaknesses and outmaneuvering them at every turn. And tonight had been no different. Mark Laval had made a critical mistake, one that cost him everything. Brooke knew this. She had always known that Frank carried a weapon. And as the events replayed in her mind, she realized something else. Frank had deliberately steered Mark into a situation where the outcome was inevitable. Mark had thought he was the one in control. But in the end, Frank had been 10 steps ahead. "The police will investigate, of course," Frank said, his voice steady. "And the media will be all over it," Brooke added grimly. "If I had been the one to fire, both law enforcement and the press would have turned it into a spectacle," Frank acknowledged. "But legally, it would have been clear-cut self-defense. He was armed, acting aggressively, and threatening my life from only a few meters away. No matter how they spin it, using lethal force in that situation would have been justified." Brooke sighed. "Yes, but the press doesn't care about what's justified." She paused before adding, "And don't forget, Mark Lavalier wasn't just anyone. He was a star athlete, a hometown hero. In the South, people like him are untouchable in the eyes of the public." Frank nodded. "For a while, the headlines will tell the story of a tragic young football player, cut down by a jealous husband with the help of a security officer. The narrative will paint him as a victim, no matter what the facts say." Brooke swallowed hard, knowing he was right. "So that's what we have to face now?" "For now," Frank said simply. "But eventually the truth will come out. The media's attention will shift, and the frenzy will die down. The real story of Mark Lavalier will emerge. And when it does, people will start to see him for who he really was." Brooke fell silent, reflecting on everything that had happened. Somewhere in the blur of that evening, between the music, the laughter, and the reckless rush of adrenaline, she had believed, if only for a moment, that she was more than just someone's wife. Lavalier had played on that, drawing her in with words designed to awaken something she hadn't even realized she was searching for. While they danced, he spoke to her about desires people rarely voiced, even within the confines of marriage. He made her listen, made her question. He made her wonder. He had painted temptation as an adventure, as something natural, something she deserved to explore. And for a fleeting moment, she had been willing to step over the line, to let go of everything she had built with Frank in exchange for the unknown. But now, standing beside her husband, she saw the truth with perfect clarity. Mark Lavalier had been nothing more than a fantasy, one that nearly cost her everything. And fantasies always come to an end. The weight of the evening pressed down on them as Frank and Brooke left the restaurant, the air outside thick with the remnants of tension and unspoken words. The flashing lights of police cars still illuminated the pavement, reporters lingering at the scene, eager to craft their version of what had transpired. But none of them truly knew. Brooke walked beside Frank in silence, her mind racing. She had nearly walked away from him tonight, nearly abandoned the life they had built together for something fleeting, something that had never been real. The realization sat heavy in her chest. Frank hadn't said much since the final confrontation with Mark Lavalier, and she wasn't sure what to expect. Would he ever look at her the same way again? Could they move past this? Finally, as they reached their car, Frank let out a slow breath and turned to face her. "So what now?" he asked, his voice even. Brooke met his gaze, searching for any sign of warmth, of forgiveness. I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I do know that I was wrong tonight. About everything. Frank nodded but said nothing. He opened the passenger door for her, and she hesitated before sliding inside. He walked around to the driver's side, settling into his seat, hands gripping the wheel. They sat there for a moment, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. I almost lost you tonight, Frank finally said. And the truth is, I don't know how to process that. Brooke's throat tightened. I never meant to hurt you, Frank. I thought I could control it, that it was just a moment, an experience, but I was wrong. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You made a choice, Brooke. And I had to stand there and watch you make it. Tears welled in her eyes. I chose wrong. But I'm choosing you now. I'll always choose you. Frank turned to her then, studying her face, searching for sincerity. Then prove it, he said quietly. Not with words. With time. She nodded, reaching for his hand, and this time he didn't pull away. As they drove away from the scene, leaving behind the chaos, the reporters, and the shattered illusion of Mark Lavalier, neither of them knew exactly what lay ahead. But for now at least they were still together. And that was enough. The end.